The sun hung low in the sky, glowing like a soft orange fire over the dry land. The cowboy rode slowly, his body leaning a little too far to one side. His hat cast a shadow over his tired face. His shirt stuck to his skin, dark from the blood that had spread across his ribs. Every breath felt heavier than the last. The quiet land stretched out around him, with nothing but wind brushing through tall grass and the distant cry of a bird circling high above. He had been on the trail since early morning, trying to reach somewhere safe, but the pain inside him kept growing stronger. His horse, dusty and tired, walked with a slow rhythm. The cowboy's hand pressed against his side where the warm red stain was spreading. He clenched his jaw to keep from groaning out loud. He didn't want to fall, not here, not in the middle of nowhere. But his vision was already turning blurry. The edges of the world looked softer, like the evening light was wrapping around him. He blinked hard, trying to stay awake. The sound of the river came before he saw it, a slow, steady rush of water brushing against rocks. His horse stopped at the bank, and for a moment, the cowboy thought he might make it after all. He tried to climb down, but the ground tilted. The next thing he knew, his boot slipped and his knees hit the dirt. The horse neighed softly, confused and worried, lowering its head near him. He reached for its neck, but missed. He fell face first into the warm dust. The world faded in and out. The light from the sunset spilled across the sky like soft paint. He could hear his own breathing, rough and uneven. He thought about how quiet everything was. No town, no road, no one to help him. He whispered a short prayer that no one could hear. Then there were footsteps. Light ones. He didn't see her at first, but the Apache woman had been nearby, gathering herbs near the riverbank. She saw the horse standing still and the body lying in the dirt. Her heart jumped, but she didn't run away. She moved closer, careful and quiet. She had seen strangers before, but this man was different. He was hurt. She knelt beside him and turned him gently to his back. His skin was pale and his breathing was shallow. His lips moved, trying to speak, but only a faint sound came out. Her hands, small but steady, pressed near the wound. She felt the warm blood. For a moment, she looked around, listening to the wind, then made a quick choice. She couldn't leave him here to die. She slid her arms under his shoulders and lifted him slowly. He was heavy, but she pulled with all her strength, dragging him toward a shaded patch near a small fire pit she had used earlier that day. The fire was gone, but the ashes were still warm. She placed his head gently on a folded piece of fabric she carried with her. The cowboy blinked weakly and saw a face above him. Dark hair braided over one shoulder, sharp cheekbones, eyes full of quiet strength. She didn't speak his language, but her calm expression told him she wasn't going to harm him. She touched his forehead and felt the heat of his fever. Her hands moved quickly. She grabbed a clay pot near the fire pit, filled it with river water and poured a little over the wound to clean away the blood. He winced but didn't fight. She could see how weak he was. She tore a strip from a piece of cloth and pressed it against his side. The sun slipped below the hills and the sky turned soft pink and gold. The river kept singing its quiet song. She whispered something in her language, a prayer maybe, or a song meant to keep him calm. Her fingers trembled just a little as she worked. This was a dangerous wound, but not impossible. She had learned long ago how to clean and heal a wound when no one else would. The cowboy's eyes fluttered open. His mouth was dry. "What, you help?" he whispered softly, though his voice barely made a sound. She didn't answer. She only looked at him, pressing her palm gently against his shoulder to keep him still. She didn't know his words, but she understood his question. She wasn't helping because of who he was. She was helping because he was a person and she couldn't walk away. She reached for a small leather pouch tied to her waist. Inside were dried herbs she had collected earlier. She crushed a few between her fingers, mixing them with water from the pot, creating a thick green paste. She placed the warm mixture around the wound carefully. The cowboy hissed through his teeth, but he didn't push her away. His breath came in sharp bursts. His hands shook as she reached for the broken metal stuck inside him. She gave him a strip of leather to bite down on. Her face stayed calm, but inside her heart beat fast. She had done this before, but never for a stranger like him. She leaned closer, steadying her hands. He closed his eyes and bit down hard. A tear rolled down the side of his face without him even knowing, not because of the pain alone, but because no one had ever looked at him with that kind of quiet courage before. The stars began to show in the sky, one by one, shining softly like they were watching everything. The river reflected their glow, The fire pit gave off a little heat as the wind passed through the camp. She worked carefully, cleaning, pressing, holding, whispering. Time passed slowly. The pain came in waves, but her voice, even though he didn't understand the words, made it easier to hold on. His hands trembled, but he didn't let go of the belt between his teeth. His breath grew shallow, then deep, then shallow again. He stared at the sky and thought of the promise he once made to himself, to never show weakness. But now, lying here in the dust with tears in his eyes, he didn't care. She noticed the way his breathing changed and moved faster. She knew she had to work carefully, but she couldn't let him drift away. She pressed her hand against his chest for a second as if reminding him to stay. He looked at her eyes. They were warm and strong. "Stay," she whispered softly, not knowing if he could hear the meaning. He nodded weakly. She worked with quiet strength until the blood slowed. Her hands were stained, but her heart didn't shake anymore. She was focused only on saving this man's life. In that quiet night, under a sky full of stars, something unspoken formed between them. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. The cowboy felt his body shaking, but not from fear, from the feeling of someone fighting for him when he couldn't fight for himself. He didn't know who she was. He didn't even know her name. But he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt safe. His breathing slowed into a tired rhythm. The world stopped spinning so fast. The pain was still there, but it no longer owned him. She sat beside him, her hand still pressed against the bandage she made. She looked at the stars, then at him, and her eyes softened. The cowboy wanted to speak, to thank her, to say something that matched what he felt. But all that came out was a weak sound. She shook her head gently, telling him without words that he didn't need to speak now. He needed to rest. The firelight flickered faintly as the wind moved through the trees. His horse stood near the river, calm now, as if it knew he was safe. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and her quiet presence carry him through the night. As the stars deepened above, he thought about how strange it was to find kindness when he least expected it. A woman who didn't know his name had saved his life, and as the night wrapped around them like a blanket, something new began to grow between them. Something strong, silent, and unforgettable. He didn't know it yet, but that night would change everything. Not just because she saved him, but because, without even knowing it, she had become a part of his story. And deep inside, in a place he didn't fully understand yet, a promise had already started to form. The night stretched long and silent after the Apache woman pulled the bullet out of the cowboy's side. The air grew cooler, wrapping the land in a soft wind that carried the smell of the river. The fire she had built earlier flickered quietly, lighting their faces with a warm orange glow. The cowboy lay back on a woven blanket she had placed under him. His breath was still shaky, but slower now. The storm of pain had passed, leaving him floating between sleep and waking. She sat beside him, her hands resting gently on her knees. Her dark hair fell over her shoulder, and the stars above painted a soft silver glow on her face. Her eyes kept watching him, making sure the bleeding didn't start again. She had seen many nights under the stars, but this one felt different. She didn't know who he was or where he came from, but tonight she had chosen to stand between him and death. The cowboy slowly opened his eyes. The world was quiet except for the sound of crickets and the soft song of the river. He could still feel the ache deep in his ribs, but it wasn't like before. The sharp edge of the pain was gone, replaced by a heavy tiredness. He saw her sitting beside him like a guardian, calm and still. His throat was dry and his voice came out rough. "You saved me," he whispered. She didn't speak. She looked at him with those same quiet eyes and nodded once. She didn't need to understand his words to know what he meant. She poured water from a small clay pot into a wooden cup and gently held it to his lips. He drank slowly, feeling the cool water slide down his throat like a gift. The stars were bright now, covering the sky like tiny lanterns. She stood up and added a few dry sticks to the fire. It crackled softly, the sparks floating into the air before fading into the night. He watched her move, graceful and steady, like someone who belonged to the land. A warm feeling grew in his chest. He had been alone for a long time, always moving from one place to another, never trusting anyone fully. But tonight, lying under the stars with this quiet woman who didn't know his name, something inside him softened. He didn't know she had already made up her mind the moment she saw him fall. She wasn't going to leave him until he was strong again. And though she didn't say it, there was something in the way she moved that told him she meant it. The cowboy closed his eyes again, letting the sound of the fire and river fill his ears. He thought about how close he had come to not seeing another sunrise. He thought about the way her hands had worked, steady and fearless. And he thought about that single tear that had escaped down his face earlier when the pain was at its worst. He had never cried in front of anyone before. But she hadn't judged him. She had just kept working. She sat close to him and placed her hand on his forehead, checking for fever. Her touch was gentle, almost like a soft breeze passing over warm stone. He looked up at her, and for the first time in a long while he felt safe. Not because the danger was gone, but because someone cared enough to stay. The fire burned lower as the night deepened. She leaned her head against a nearby rock, keeping her eyes half open in case he needed anything. The cowboy drifted into a restless sleep, waking every so often to see her still there, watching over him. He didn't know it yet, but that night carved something deep inside his heart. Morning came slowly. The first golden light touched the edge of the hills and birds began to sing. The river shimmered like a silver ribbon in the early sun. The cowboy opened his eyes and felt the weight of a new day. His side hurt, but it was a steady kind of pain, one he could live with. He tried to sit up, but she quickly moved to his side, gently pressing her hand against his shoulder to keep him from moving too fast. He smiled weakly. "I'll be fine," he whispered, though his voice still sounded tired. She shook her head slowly, her expression calm but firm. She handed him a small bowl of warm broth she had made from roots and herbs. The smell was earthy and light. He drank it in small sips, letting the warmth spread through his body. For the next few days, she cared for him without words. She washed the bandage with clean river water every morning, pressed new herbs against the wound, and sat nearby in silence. He tried to speak a few times, to ask her name, to tell her how grateful he was, but language stood between them like a quiet wall. Still, they found a way to understand each other through small gestures. She would lift her hand toward the river to ask if he wanted water. He would nod. He would point toward the fire if he felt cold, and she would build it up again. Their silence didn't feel heavy. It felt natural, like they didn't need many words to share the same space. Every evening, when the sun dipped low, he would look at the horizon and think about what happened the night she saved him. He didn't remember everything clearly, but he remembered her eyes, calm and strong. He remembered the way her hands never shook. And most of all, he remembered how it felt to be seen, not as a stranger, not as someone to be feared, but as a human being worth saving. One evening, when the fire was bright again and the stars stretched across the night sky, he turned to her and touched his chest with his fingers, then pointed at her. She looked at him curiously. He didn't have the right words, but he wanted to say something that had been building inside him since the night she saved his life. He whispered softly, "I promise." She tilted her head, not understanding the words but sensing the weight behind them. He placed his hand over his heart again, then over the bandage she had tied days ago. His eyes were clear and steady. He didn't know how long their paths would cross or where life would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just the woman who saved him. She was the person he would protect with every breath he had left. She didn't ask for a promise. She didn't even know he had made one, but in his heart it was as real as the scar on his side. He had spent years living like a man with no ties. But now, lying under the stars beside her, he felt something anchor him to this moment. Days turned to nights and nights back into days. His strength returned slowly. He began to sit up by the fire, helping her gather wood, brushing his horse and listening to the quiet music of the river. They didn't need many words to share their days. Her laughter was soft, rare, but when it came, it made the world feel warmer. The cowboy had seen many places, many people, but no memory stayed with him like this one. The night she knelt beside him, pulling him away from the edge. The way she didn't look at him with fear. The way she stayed. When it was time for him to leave, his heart grew heavy. The river was still flowing. The stars were still shining above, and the fire still cracked in the quiet. She stood near the river bank, her hands folded gently. He stepped closer, slow and careful, still feeling the ache of the wound, but standing tall again. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Thank you," he said softly. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling. She nodded once, her braid falling over her shoulder. He climbed onto his horse, but before leaving, he turned back and looked at her one more time. There were no grand speeches, no loud promises. Just a quiet moment between two souls who had shared something unforgettable. As he rode away, the wind brushed against his face, and his heart held on to that promise he had made in the silence. He would protect her no matter where life carried him. She might never know how deeply that night had changed him, but he would carry it forever like a flame inside his chest. The land stretched out wide and endless before him, but it didn't feel empty anymore, because somewhere behind him, by the river under those same stars, there was someone who had saved his life without asking for anything in return. And every step his horse took away from that place was a reminder of the night a cowboy cried. Not because of pain, but because a stranger had shown him a kind of courage and kindness that would live in his heart forever.